One stone was placed on top of another. No mortar, no bolts, no concrete of any kind. And that structure is still standing. It still carries weight. It still serves its purpose. After more than 3,000 years. This isn't a legend. It's not an exaggeration. This happens every day on a small crossing in southern Greece, where a farmer drives his tractor over it in the morning without even looking down at what's beneath his wheels. And perhaps that indifference is the greatest compliment any structure could ever receive. But what makes a bridge last for 3,000 years while modern bridges need major repairs in less than a century? The answer isn't some lost technology or a secret buried with the builders. It's something far simpler and far more challenging than any mathematical formula. 7 bridges were chosen to tell this story. Among them is the oldest bridge on the planet, which went 100 years without even being recognized as a bridge. There's another that was built by a monk who learned how to cast iron after being turned away at a ferry crossing. There's one that an emperor ordered dismantled immediately after the greatest victory of his reign. And there's another that survives only because it is destroyed every single year. They all have one thing in common, and that thing isn't the material, the technique, or the size. It will become clear at the end, and anyone paying close attention may figure it out before it's even revealed. Our first stop is in southern Greece, in a place called Arkadiko, near the ancient city of Tiryns. There, spanning a dry ravine, stands a stone crossing measuring 22 meters, or about 72 feet, in length and roughly 4 meters, or 13 feet high. The roadway at the top is barely 2 meters, or 6.5 feet wide. That measurement is no accident. It's exactly the space needed for a 2-horse chariot to pass at speed without its wheels slipping over the edges. And those edges are still there. Side stones designed to keep the wheels from falling off. This isn't some rural footpath. It's a Bronze Age military highway with built-in guardrails. British archaeologist Richard Hope Simpson spent years mapping the Mycenaean roads in this region and uncovered an entire network. 4 similar bridges still exist along the same route, connecting fortresses from that era. The road linked Tiryns to Epidaurus, and what it carried wasn't grain. It carried soldiers. The builders of this bridge didn't know the pointed arch, and they didn't master the classical vault. Instead, they used what engineers call a corbelled vault, or false arch. Each layer of stone projected slightly beyond the one below it until the 2 walls met at the top. No mortar, no iron clamps, just the weight of each massive block holding the next one in place. Place your hand on one of those stones on a hot summer day, and you'll feel something surprising. Cold. The mass of the stone is so enormous that sunlight can't heat its interior, not even after months of exposure. And that same massive weight is precisely what allows the structure to support everything passing over it. The man who placed the final stone had no structural calculations, no computer models. He couldn't simulate the load before opening the passage. The only way to test it was to put his own weight on top and wait. 3,000 years later, a tractor drives over it, and the stone doesn't even move. For a long time, this was considered the oldest bridge in the world. Until someone took a closer look at an excavation carried out decades earlier in southern Iraq. In the 1920s, a French expedition excavated the mound of Tello in Mesopotamia, where the ancient Sumerian city of Girsu once stood. Beneath the sand, they uncovered a fired brick structure about 130 feet long. 2 massive walls curved toward each other, leaving a narrow passage between them. The preserved masonry stood more than 10 feet high. No one knew what it was. Reports from the time described it as an enigmatic structure of unknown function. Some believed it was a temple. Others thought it was a dam. Some even suggested it was a reservoir. The bricks bore inscriptions naming the ruler Ur-Nanshe, along with a dedication to the god Ningirsu. The date was right there on the surface, the 3rd millennium BC. But its purpose remained a mystery. For nearly a century, the structure was left exposed to the elements, without a roof or proper conservation, because no one understood what they were actually preserving. The answer came from an archive. Archaeologist Sebastian Ray, from the British Museum, compared old photographs from the 1930s with satellite images from the 1960s. The outline of an ancient canal suddenly appeared in the images, running directly through the center of the structure. The walls were pillars. The narrow passage was the canal bed. And above that canal was a platform. The oldest bridge in the world had spent a century buried without anyone realizing it was a bridge. It had been right in front of everyone, photographed, studied, and published in scientific papers. And nobody saw it. A bridge can be completely built and still go unnoticed for generations. Our third stop takes us to China, to Hebei province, where a small river called the Xiaohe flows beneath an extraordinary bridge. At first glance, the bridge looks wrong. The arch is too low, too flat. It almost looks like it's going to collapse right in the middle. The craftsman who completed it in the early 6th century was named Li Chun. The main span stretches about 121 feet, while the rise of the arch is just over 23 feet. At the time, builders typically used semicircular arches because a semicircle was predictable. Li Chun did something completely different. He used only a segment of a circle, creating an arch that was almost flat. This type of arch pushes the surrounding banks outward rather than simply pushing downward. It's more dangerous. It demands greater control. But Li Chun went even further. At the ends of the arch, where solid stone fill would normally be used, he opened 4 smaller passages. Each one is a small arch in its own right. Together, they removed an estimated 700 tons of weight from the structure, the equivalent of a medium-sized freight train, eliminated from the bridge with a single design decision. And there's something else about this detail. When the river floods, the water can flow through the side openings instead of slamming into the structure like a wall. The bridge stops being a barrier and becomes a sieve. The floodwater flows through it, rather than against it. The 28 limestone blocks of the main arch are connected by butterfly-shaped iron clamps. These clamps allow a tiny amount of movement between the blocks, instead of forcing them to crack when the ground shakes. But the most tense moment in the construction of any arch isn't a flood. It isn't an earthquake. It's the day the wooden scaffolding is removed. While the arch is being built, the timber supports hold everything in place. The arch cannot support itself yet. Then comes the moment when the wood is taken away, and that's when you find out whether the master calculated everything correctly or got it wrong. Li Chun was there when the final supports were removed from beneath his arch. Over 14 centuries, this bridge has survived 10 major floods and 8 wars. It endured an earthquake whose epicenter was just 40 kilometers from its foundations. In the 1930s, architect Liang Sicheng personally measured the arch and couldn't believe the numbers he was seeing in his notebook. In Europe, bridges with this kind of remarkably flat and daring profile wouldn't begin appearing until 7 centuries later. This bridge never suffered a single battle scar. The next one survived for just 165 years, and the people who destroyed it were the very empire that had built it. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Emperor Trajan needed to cross the Danube to conquer Dacia, a territory that is now part of Romania. A boat crossing might work for a military campaign, but it wouldn't be enough to control and maintain a province. The task was given to the engineer Apollodorus of Damascus, the same man who designed Trajan's Forum in Rome. Apollodorus had 2 years, and a river that had never before been crossed by a permanent structure. His solution was to divert the river using temporary channels, expose the dry riverbed, and build the foundations directly on the bottom. 20 stone piers, each taller than a 10-story building, were spaced roughly 50 meters apart. Above them rose wooden arches, total length, more than 100 meters. On the bricks of the foundations, soldiers carved the names of their legions. 4th Legion, 7th Legion, auxiliary cohorts from the Empire's frontier regions. Someone pressed a finger into the fresh clay and marked the number of his unit. He wasn't signing a masterpiece. He was recording the work he had done. Trajan crossed the river, defeated the Dacians, and transformed their land into a Roman province. The bridge worked, and that was exactly why it was destroyed. After Trajan's death, Emperor Hadrian looked at the bridge and saw an open door. A structure that allows you to enter also allows the enemy to enter. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded that Hadrian ordered the wooden decking to be removed. The greatest crossing of antiquity was dismantled not by a flood, not by an invasion, and not by the passage of time. It was dismantled by the man who inherited it. The same historian reports that Apollodorus fell out of favor, was exiled, and ultimately executed. The emperor removed the bridge's wooden decking, and then removed the engineer himself. 400 years later, the writer Procopius saw the Danube and described only pillars rising from the water. He wrote that the crossing had disappeared, but its foundations were still there, as if they wanted to show what human beings were capable of achieving. 20 pillars still stand in the river today, on the border between 2 countries. In the 15th century, on the Tibetan plateau, A monk named Thangtong Gyalpo was turned away by a ferryman who refused to take him across. Instead of arguing, he reached a conclusion. If crossing depends on another person's willingness, then you need a crossing that depends on no one. So he learned how to smelt iron. He studied the composition of the metal. He learned how to forge it. He learned how to connect links. Every link was made by hand, and a single weak link could mean death for anyone crossing the bridge. The monk understood something fundamental. A chain doesn't break in the middle. It breaks at its weakest point. To finance the iron, he formed a theater company and began putting on performances, using the proceeds to purchase the metal. The Tibetan theater tradition that is now considered part of the country's national heritage was, in part, born from the need to buy materials for bridges. Different sources indicate that he built between 50 and 80 suspension bridges made of iron chains. The largest crossed the Brahmaputra River, with a span of more than 130 meters. When it was completed, it was the longest unsupported span in the world. The wooden decking rested directly on the chains, and the bridge was barely wider than the length of an outstretched arm. In Europe, suspension bridges of this kind would not appear until centuries later. In Bhutan, links forged in that mountain workshop still survive today. In southern Peru, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, spanning the Apurimac River Canyon, there is a bridge made entirely from braided grass. No metal, no concrete, no bolts. 28 meters long, just over 1 meter wide, and 30 meters above the water. It lasts exactly 1 year. Every June, 4 communities descend into the canyon carrying bundles of grass. The women braid thin ropes. The men weave those ropes together into 6 massive cables. The cables are anchored to stone foundations that have existed since the time of the Inca Empire. And then something happens that takes the breath away of anyone seeing it for the first time. The old bridge, the one the children crossed the week before, is cut down and thrown into the river. The 2 sides of the canyon are left disconnected. 2 worlds separated once again, with no safety net and no alternative. 2 master weavers begin crafting the new span, each starting from one side and working toward the other. The process takes 3 days. On the 4th day, there is a celebration. This bridge is listed as part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage, not as a structure, but as a ritual. What is being preserved is not the bridge itself. It is the knowledge, the repetition, the identity of the people who rebuild it. A bridge that never grows old because it is never allowed to grow old. In Spain, spanning the Tagus River, the Alcantara Bridge was completed sometime around the early 2nd century AD. 6 granite arches, roughly 200 meters long, rising nearly 50 meters above the water. The massive blocks were fitted together without mortar, held in place by nothing but precise craftsmanship and weight. At the center of the bridge, its builder, Gaius Julius Lacer, left an inscription inside a small temple beside the structure. "I built a bridge that will last forever, as long as the world endures." Inside that temple lies Lacer's own tomb. He remained beside his creation. And then, the bridge began to come under attack. In the 10th century, one of its arches was destroyed during a siege. It was rebuilt 300 years later, using stone from the same quarries. In the 16th century, Spanish troops blew up part of the bridge to stop a rival army. It was rebuilt 2 years later. Less than 50 years passed. At the beginning of the 19th century, British Allied forces blew up that same section again to prevent French troops from crossing. Soldiers were placing gunpowder beneath a structure their own professional predecessors had built to survive for centuries. And they used gunpowder precisely because they knew it would survive for centuries. The Roman foundations never needed to be replaced. What was destroyed and rebuilt were the upper arches. What no army ever managed to shake were the foundations. 7 bridges, 3,000 years separating the first from the last. Greece, Iraq, China, Romania, Tibet, Peru, Spain. Different materials, different cultures, different purposes, and yet they all had one thing in common. None of these builders knew how to calculate structural loads with modern precision. There were no formulas, no computer simulations, no advanced testing beforehand. The only way to know whether a structure would hold was to place the first human being on it and watch. That's why every one of them built with extra margin. More stone, more chain, more rope, more weaving, not to waste materials, but to avoid failure. That extra strength was the only safety system they had. Modern engineering calculates everything down to the millimeter. Structures are designed right up to the permitted limits, without adding a single unnecessary gram. A French Senate report acknowledged that a quarter of the country's public bridges require urgent repairs. In Germany, data from the Federal Institute for Infrastructure indicated that 1 out of every 8 bridges on federal highways was in poor condition. Not because today's engineers are worse, but because they know exactly where the limit is, and they build right up to it. The ancients didn't know where the limit was, so they stayed far away from it. Some argue that ancient bridges have survived because they were built with enormous safety margins and a deep respect for the unknown. Others point out that we only see the ones that survived, while hundreds of ancient bridges may have collapsed and disappeared without leaving any record behind. Both sides have a point. Back to that dry ravine in southern Greece. There's no ticket booth, no safety railing, no line of tourists. No builder carved his name into any stone. No emperor came to inaugurate the structure. No temple was ever built beside it. Every morning, a farmer drives his tractor across it. He doesn't look up. He doesn't think about 3,000 years of history. He's thinking about the work waiting for him. And maybe that's exactly the point. A bridge built to be used, not admired, can end up being used for far longer than any monument built to impress. The people who laid those stones were working for someone they would never meet. Someone who hadn't even been born yet. And today, that unknown person crosses their work without knowing who they were, when they lived, or how they built it. All they know is that the road is still there, and it still holds. That is what these 7 bridges have in common. Not the materials, not the techniques, but the willingness to build for someone who hasn't been born yet. If stories like this mean something to you, stick around. There's so much more buried, forgotten, and waiting to be rediscovered.